stable, and slow enough to land on short decks. Speed was the enemy of control. But Vought's chief designer, Rex Beisel, believed it could be done. If they could build a fighter around the most powerful engine in the world, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a monstrous 18-cylinder radial. The rest would follow. The engine alone delivered more than 2,000 horsepower. It required a massive 13-foot propeller, too large for any normal landing gear, so the engineers bent the wings into an inverted gull shape, lowering the landing gear mounts while keeping them short and strong. That distinctive shape would become the Corsair's signature. Elegant in appearance, but born purely of necessity. The first prototype, the XF4U-1, flew on May 29, 1940. It was unlike anything the Navy had ever seen. In its first tests, it broke the 400 mph barrier, the first single-engine U.S. fighter to do so. On paper, it was a triumph. In reality, it was a beast that refused to be tamed. Pilots soon discovered the Corsair's dark side. The long nose, stretched to house that giant engine, blocked forward visibility during takeoff and landing. The massive torque of the propeller caused the aircraft to pull violently to one side. On carrier decks, this was deadly. Landing attempts often ended in shattered landing gear, broken wings, or worse. The Corsair was powerful, but unpredictable. It bounced, skidded, and slammed into decks with terrifying force. The Navy gave it a new nickname, Ensign Eliminator. By late 1941, despite its raw performance, the Corsair was considered too dangerous for carrier duty. The Navy turned instead to the safer, more forgiving Grumman F-6F Hellcat. For the men who had designed the Corsair, it was a devastating blow. Years of work were being grounded before the war had even begun for America. But the story didn't end there. The U.S. Marine Corps, desperate for any advantage in the brutal island campaigns ahead, saw potential in the Corsair's ferocity. Unlike the Navy, Marines operated mostly from rough land bases rather than carriers, and they were willing to take the risk. If it could fly faster, climb higher, and strike harder than anything else in the Pacific, they wanted it. So, in early 1943, the Corsair was handed to the Marines. Engineers worked furiously to tame its flaws, raising the pilot's seat for better visibility, modifying the landing gear, and adjusting the wing flaps for smoother handling. Test pilots, men like Boot Campbell and Tom Blackburn, began pushing the aircraft to its limits, learning its language, its temperament, its hunger. They discovered that if handled correctly, the Corsair was unstoppable. It could climb faster than any Japanese aircraft, dive steeper, and outrun the Zero by over 50 mph. Its 650 caliber Browning machine guns shredded anything they touched. It wasn't a dancer, it was a hammer. By mid-1943, the Corsair was finally ready for combat. The Marines of VMF 124, stationed in the Solomon Islands, would be the first to fly it into battle. What they didn't know was that they were about to unleash one of the most feared war machines of the entire Pacific theater. And high above the emerald jungles of the Solomons, Japanese pilots would soon discover the days of ruling the skies were over. The technological angle. The beast of engineering. F-4U Corsair was more than a fighter. It was a declaration of American industrial will. At its heart lay the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, the most powerful radial engine of its era. Its 2,000 horsepower thrust the Corsair past 400 mph, nearly 100 mm faster than Japan's vaunted Zero. In combat, that margin was everything. Its distinctive inverted gull wing wasn't just for looks. It allowed shorter, stronger landing gear that could withstand carrier landings, and it gave the aircraft its signature stance. Aggressive, almost animalistic. The Corsair's massive propeller, over 13 feet wide, generated such torque that pilots had to countersteer with brute force during takeoff. But once airborne, it moved with a terrifying grace. Beneath its skin, armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks made it far tougher than any Japanese counterpart. The Zero, in contrast, was built for agility, not survival. A single burst from the Corsair's 6 Browning 50 caliber guns could rip it apart. And yet, what made the Corsair truly deadly was not its speed, nor its guns, nor its strength. It was the way these came together to create something fundamentally new, a sky predator that hunted on its own terms. Where earlier fighters had relied on tight turning and finesse, the Corsair was a machine of energy warfare. Strike, climb, and strike again. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could enter a fight with overwhelming speed and leave before the enemy could respond. It turned air combat into a one-sided hunt. Even its flaws became assets. That long nose that once blocked visibility made it aerodynamically perfect for high-speed dives. Its heavy frame gave it stability in a vertical attack, and the high-pitched shriek of air rushing through its wing root vents, the sound that terrified Japanese pilots, gave it the chilling nickname, Whistling Death. The tactical angle, how the hunters learned to kill, but even the best aircraft is nothing without the right tactics. The men who first flew the Corsair had to unlearn everything they knew about dogfighting. Against the Zero, turning was suicide. American pilots instead developed a style of combat that played to their new machine's strengths: speed, altitude, and surprise. This new method was called boom and zoom. Instead of circling in prolonged dogfights, Corsair pilots climbed high above their enemies, attacked in a single devastating dive, then used their superior speed to escape before the Zero could react. A Zero could outturn anything, but it couldn't outrun a Corsair. In this way, the Corsair rewrote the air war. It became the first true energy fighter of the Pacific, relying not on maneuver, but momentum. American squadrons trained relentlessly, practicing steep dives from 20,000 feet, gunnery bursts lasting barely 2 seconds, and high-speed climbs into the clouds. In their debriefs, pilots began reporting something remarkable. For the first time in the war, they felt confident. The Zero was no longer a ghost in the sky. It was prey. When the first combat reports came back from the Solomons in early 1943, the transformation was undeniable. Corsair units recorded kill ratios of 11-1, eerily mirroring the advantage the Japanese once held. The hunter had become the hunted. But what truly unsettled the Japanese was not just the Corsair's performance, it was the psychological shift it represented. For 2 years, the Imperial pilots had fought believing their superiority was ordained, that the sky itself favored them. The Corsair shattered that illusion. Each time one appeared on the horizon, they knew they were no longer fighting a desperate, defensive foe. They were facing a machine built to destroy them. And soon, Japanese intelligence officers would begin to ask the question whispered through their ranks. What is this aircraft? The human angle. Men behind the wings. Every war machine carries the soul of the men who fly it. For the pilots of the Marine squadrons, VMF-124, VMF-214, and others, the Corsair was more than a weapon. It was a wild animal that demanded respect. The cockpit was cramped, hot, and deafening. The nose stretched so far ahead that pilots could barely see the runway during takeoff. One mistake, and the torque could flip the aircraft on its back before it ever left the ground. The Corsair punished carelessness, but to those who mastered it, it became an extension of their will. Pilots like Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, leader of the legendary Black Sheep Squadron, made the Corsair famous and feared. Boyington, a tough and unpredictable Marine ace, described the aircraft as a brute that forgives nothing but kills everything. Under his command, the Black Sheep achieved 94 aerial victories in just 12 weeks. a record that stunned both allies and enemies. For many pilots, the Corsair became a strange companion, dangerous but loyal. They spoke of the feeling when the double Wasp engine roared to life beneath them. The vibration, the tremor, the sense of unstoppable power. In the Pacific heat, sweat mixed with adrenaline as they launched from rough coral airstrips, the sound of their takeoff echoing like thunder across the islands. Each mission was a test of nerve. They faced deadly flak, sudden ambushes, and endless fatigue. But the Corsair gave them something no aircraft had before, the sense that survival was possible. It gave them hope. For many who had once watched their comrades die helplessly against the Zero, that hope meant everything. The enemy angle, the shock in Japanese ranks for the Imperial Japanese Navy, the arrival of the Corsair was both bewildering and devastating. In 1942, Japanese pilots had flown with near-religious confidence. They believed their training, their tactics, and their Zero fighter represented the pinnacle of aerial warfare. But by 1943, strange reports began filtering back from the Solomon Islands. Pilots described a new American plane, blue-black, fast, and impossible to shake. It attacked from above, vanished into the sun, and returned without warning. At first, Japanese intelligence dismissed the rumors. They believed the Americans were still flying inferior models. But soon, wreckage began washing ashore. Broken wings with bent joints, engine parts stamped with Vought. Engineers in Tokyo examined the remains and realized something alarming. This was a machine unlike anything they had faced. In captured diaries, Japanese pilots wrote of their encounters. "It does not turn with us. It comes from the sky like a hawk and leaves before the guns can find it. Our bullets do not harm it. Its skin is like iron." They called it the Blue Demon, or simply the one that whistles before death. In aerial reports, the Zero's once invincible reputation began to crumble. Even the most experienced Japanese aces, men with dozens of kills, started falling to Corsair guns. The psychological toll was immense. Confidence turned into caution. Caution into fear. By late 1943, Japanese squadrons began avoiding direct engagements with Corsair formations whenever possible. The hunter's instinct that had once defined the Zero pilots had vanished. The moral and strategic angle, power and consequence. The Corsair's dominance raised a deeper question, not just of victory, but of cost. In the Pacific skies, technological supremacy had turned the tide. But it also revealed the brutal reality of industrial warfare. Japan's finest pilots, trained over years, were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Corsair was not simply defeating the Zero. It was erasing the generation that had built Japan's aerial legend. For America, the Corsair became a symbol of adaptation, the embodiment of a lesson learned through fire and loss. It showed that in modern war, survival belonged not to the nation that struck first, but to the one that learned fastest. But even among American pilots, the victories carried weight. Many later admitted that shooting down an enemy, watching a burning aircraft fall into the ocean, brought no joy, only relief. As one Marine ace wrote in his logbook, "We were not fighting men anymore. We were fighting machines, and praying ours was better." In that sentence lies the essence of the Corsair's story. A weapon born from desperation, perfected by human will, and unleashed into a sky where mercy had no place. And as 1943 drew to a close, its legend was only beginning. Ahead lay the true test, the great air battles of Rabaul and Truk Lagoon, where the Corsair would face the remnants of Japan's air power, head-on. The year is 1943 across. The Solomon Islands. The jungle burns with war. On Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, Marine ground crews labor under the pitiless sun. Sweat and oil stain their uniforms as they load ammunition belts. 6 guns per plane, each filled with 400 rounds of 50 caliber fire. Above them, the new arrivals stand gleaming in the heat. Dark blue machines with bent wings and shark-like noses. The F-4U Corsair has come to war. In February, VMF-124, under the command of Major William E. Giza, becomes the first Marine squadron to take the Corsair into combat. Their mission: protect American ground forces and challenge Japanese air superiority over the Solomon Islands chain. The first encounters are chaos. The Corsair's power is overwhelming, but its temperament is still dangerous. Some landings end in wreckage, others in fire. Yet once airborne, the truth becomes clear. This machine was born to kill. On February 14, 1943, Corsairs of VMF 124 meet a formation of Japanese Zeros over Kahili Airfield, Bougainville. The engagement lasts only minutes. Diving from 20,000 feet, the Corsairs tear through the enemy formation in a single thunderous pass. The Zeros, agile but slower, attempt to turn. But the Americans are already climbing back into the clouds. 4 Zeros fall burning into the sea. Not a single Corsair is lost. It is the first of many such encounters. Reports flood in from across the theater. From New Georgia, Vella La Vella, and Rendova. Everywhere, the same pattern repeats. The Japanese dive to intercept. The Corsairs strike first. Marine pilots learn to exploit every inch of speed and power. They hit from above, disappear, then strike again. For the first time in the Pacific, Japanese formations are forced into defensive patterns. The once predatory Zeros now fly cautiously, breaking formation, diving for escape. By summer, the Corsair is rewriting the balance of the air war. In June 1943, VMF 214, soon to be known as the Black Sheep Squadron, forms under the leadership of Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, a charismatic and unpredictable ace who thrives on chaos. Boyington, already a veteran of the Flying Tigers, understands the Corsair's temperament. He trains his men ruthlessly, not to dogfight, but to ambush. Never turn with a Zero, he tells them. Climb, dive, and shoot. That's it. Under his command, the Black Sheep turn the Corsair into a weapon of psychological warfare. They strike in small, fast groups, always from the sun, always with overwhelming force. Japanese pilots begin referring to the Corsair formations as the Blue Angels of Death. In one mission over Balale Airfield, Boyington's squadron engages nearly 30 Zeros. The fight lasts less than 10 minutes. 10 enemy aircraft are destroyed. Not one Corsair fails to return. The speed of their attacks leaves even American observers stunned. Combat cameramen describe the Corsairs diving like falling stars, their gunfire flickering in bursts of light. Pilots report the eerie scream of airflow through the wing roots, the sound the Japanese would later remember as the whistle of death. Behind the victories, however, lies a brutal truth. These battles are not fought at a distance. Many Corsair pilots return with bullet holes in their fuselages, with control cables shredded, with blood on the cockpit glass. The Zero remains deadly at close range. One mistake, one missed shot, and the tables turn instantly. But slowly, through fire and loss, a new confidence grows. The Marine squadrons are no longer the hunted. They are the predators. In a single 6-week span, Corsair units claim over 200 enemy aircraft for fewer than 20 losses. An almost unthinkable ratio. By late 1943, Japanese Air Command begins issuing new orders. Avoid direct engagement with the F-4U type fighter unless in superior numbers. It is an admission of defeat, though no one dares say it aloud. In the skies above the Solomons, the balance has shifted. And in the distance, across the horizon, another storm gathers. The great fortress of Rabaul, Japan's last major air stronghold in the South Pacific. The Corsairs' greatest test awaits. By the end of 1943, the Allied offensive across the South Pacific had gathered unstoppable momentum. The Solomon Islands campaign had bled Japan's air wings dry. But one fortress still loomed: Rabaul. Nestled on the northern tip of New Britain, Rabaul was the crown jewel of Japan's Pacific defense, a volcanic harbor bristling with anti-aircraft guns, airfields, and more than 350 aircraft. For 2 years, it had been untouchable, a bastion guarded by elite Zero squadrons and experienced pilots. But in late October 1943, the hunters arrived, Corsairs from VMF 214, VMF 215, and VMF 321 launched from forward airstrips on Bougainville and Vella La Vella, joining formations of Army and Navy aircraft in the largest coordinated air assault yet attempted in the Pacific. The mission? Cripple Rabaul's air power before the ground invasion began. The morning of November 11, 1943, Remembrance Day, dawned clear and windless. The Corsairs climbed in formation, their dark bodies gleaming against the blue. Below them stretched hundreds of miles of open ocean. Ahead lay a fortress spewing black flak into the sky. Radar operators in Rabaul's command bunkers sounded the alarm. Sirens wailed. The defenders scrambled. Dozens of Zeros took off, forming a swirling wall of silver in the sun. At 0930 hours, the first Corsairs dove in from 15,000 feet. They descended like hawks, throttles wide open, 6 guns blazing. The speed was astonishing. The Japanese defenders, accustomed to dueling against slower Hellcats and Wildcats, were stunned. The Corsairs didn't turn or circle. They cut straight through, firing, climbing, diving again. In the confusion, one Marine pilot, Captain Ken Walsh, engaged 7 Zeros alone. He shot down 3 before being hit himself, bailing out over the jungle. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for that mission. All day, the battle raged. By sunset, more than 50 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. The Corsairs lost fewer than 10. But Rabaul would not fall easily. The Japanese regrouped, determined to reclaim the skies. Over the following weeks, wave after wave of Corsairs struck again, hitting airfields, fuel depots, and shipping. They flew low-level strafing runs through storms of anti-aircraft fire, sometimes returning with wings shredded and paint blistered from near misses. By December, Rabaul's air defenses were collapsing. Japanese pilots began flying fewer sorties each day. Some units reported fuel shortages. Others had no replacements for lost men. The once proud Zero squadrons were now skeleton crews. Young, under-trained boys sent to fight veterans in superior machines. When Allied reconnaissance photos showed hundreds of burned-out aircraft on Rabaul's runways, commanders knew the fortress was finished. But the Corsairs' campaign wasn't over. In early 1944, attention turned west to Truk Lagoon, another critical Japanese base, known as the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Here, the Imperial Navy's combined fleet had anchored its last major warships. Destroyers, carriers, cruisers, all sheltered behind coral reefs and anti-aircraft batteries. On February 17, 1944, the U.S. Navy launched Operation Hailstone, a 2-day assault involving hundreds of aircraft, including Corsairs flying from both carriers and island bases. From dawn to dusk, the sky became a storm. Corsairs strafed airfields, destroyed hangars, and tore apart aircraft on the ground. Pilots described the lagoon below as a cauldron of fire. Ships exploded one after another. The carrier Shokaku, the cruiser Katori, and dozens of transports turned into smoking ruins. In just 2 days, Japan lost over 250 aircraft and 40 ships. Truk Lagoon, once impregnable, became a graveyard. For the Japanese pilots who survived, the message was clear. The age of the Zero was over. The sky now belonged to the Americans, to the blue-winged predators that struck without warning and vanished into the clouds. In post-war interviews, surviving Japanese officers admitted that by 1944, they had lost hope of regaining air superiority. Their factories could not keep up with American production. Their new models, like the A6M50 and Kawanishi N1K George, could not match the Corsair's combination of speed, strength, and endurance. The hunter had become the master. For the Marines and Navy pilots who fought through Rabaul and Truk, the victories were both exhilarating and sobering. The Corsair had proven itself beyond doubt, but every triumph came at a cost. Many of the men who flew those missions never returned. In squadron tents across the islands, empty bunks told the real story of war. Machines could dominate the sky, but they could not shield their pilots from fate. Still, the legend of the Corsair had been forged in fire. It had turned fear into mastery, weakness into power, and defeat into dominance. The Pacific War would never be the same again. By the spring of 1944, the Pacific Ocean had changed color. Where once it reflected the red insignia of Japan's rising sun, it now mirrored the deep blue wings of American aircraft. Corsairs, Hellcats, Avengers, sweeping across its vast expanse like a tide that could no longer be turned. The victories at Rabaul and Truk Lagoon had shattered Japan's defensive perimeter. With their air power crippled and supply lines collapsing, the Imperial Navy could no longer protect its island outposts. The Zero, once a symbol of invincibility, had become an artifact of an earlier war, outclassed and outnumbered. In the months that followed, the Corsair became the spearhead of every advance. From Bougainville to Peleliu, from Tarawa to the Marianas, the bent-wing fighter was there, strafing airfields, protecting landing craft, diving into storms of tracer fire to silence enemy guns. It had started as a weapon of desperation. Now it was the embodiment of dominance. Japanese pilots, who once entered combat with the confidence of hunters, now flew with resignation. They knew what awaited them: aircraft faster, heavier, and flown by men trained in a war machine that seemed infinite in its reach. Reports from captured Japanese officers revealed a chilling truth. By mid-1944, most new recruits had less than 100 hours of flight time before being sent into battle. Many had never fired their guns in actual air combat. The Corsair pilots, by contrast, were veterans. Hardened by endless missions, they had learned every quirk of their machine: the stall at low speeds, the torque on takeoff, the shock of its dive. The aircraft had become an extension of their instincts. The balance of power was no longer in question. In June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, confirmed what the men at Rabaul already knew. Japan's air arm was finished. More than 350 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day. The Americans lost fewer than $30. Many of those kills belonged to the Corsair. One Marine pilot described the battle in simple words: "They came at us, all angles, all directions, but they couldn't touch us. It was like they were made of paper, and we were steel." The technological and industrial contrast was staggering. While Japan struggled to produce a few dozen fighters each month, American factories, from Connecticut to California, were rolling out F-4U Corsairs by the hundreds. At its peak, one Corsair was completed every 85 minutes, and the design kept evolving. New versions like the F-4U-1D and F-4U-4 introduced better engines, improved visibility, and the ability to launch from carriers, solving the one flaw that had limited the aircraft's early use. By the end of 1944, the Corsair flew from nearly every major American carrier group in the Pacific. The plane that had once been too difficult for carrier landings was now a trusted partner in the Navy's most ambitious operations. Legend grew with every mission. Its kill ratio reached an astonishing 11-to-1, one of the highest in aviation history. But for the men who flew it, victory was never simple. They had watched comrades vanish in the clouds, disappear into the sea, or burn within sight of home. They knew the price of air superiority. In diary entries and letters home, many wrote not about glory, but about survival, about the strange silence that followed each mission, when the adrenaline faded and the world returned to stillness. "You don't cheer when you land," wrote one Corsair pilot. "You just count the names. Then you go again tomorrow." The Pacific War was far from over, but its outcome was now inevitable. The Corsair had done what few machines in history could claim. It had changed the course of a war not through numbers alone, but through sheer performance, ingenuity, and willpower. It had been born from a sketch on a draftsman's table in Connecticut. It had bled over island jungles, thousands of miles from home. And it had risen, quite literally, as the angel of vengeance over an empire that once seemed unstoppable. By 1945, the war that had once seemed infinite was collapsing into its final inferno. Tokyo was in flames. The Pacific, once ruled by the Imperial Navy, was now an American sea. The Corsair had played its part, not just as a fighter, but as a symbol of transformation. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, the Corsair was still flying. Over Okinawa, over Iwo Jima, and above the ruins of cities that no longer had names. For the men who survived those final missions, victory felt less like triumph and more like exhaustion. But even as the smoke cleared, the legend of the bent-wing bird was only beginning. In the years that followed, the world entered a new kind of war. One fought not across oceans, but across ideology. The Cold War dawned, and the Corsair, astonishingly, refused to fade into history. Korea, the second life of a legend. In 1950, 5 years after Japan's surrender, Corsairs once again took to the skies, this time over the mountains of the Korean peninsula. Jet aircraft now ruled the skies, but the Corsair found a new role: ground attack. The same ruggedness that had carried it through Rabaul and Truk now made it invaluable against entrenched North Korean and Chinese positions. It could carry rockets, napalm tanks, and bombs, diving through anti-aircraft fire with the same fearless precision it had shown in the Pacific. Marine pilots once again painted the blue wings with salt and smoke. The jet age had begun, but the Corsair proved that speed was not everything. Its slow, controlled flight made it perfect for close air support, protecting soldiers on the ground in a way no jet could match. One Marine, writing home from Korea, summed it up simply: "It's the same old bird doing a new job, and it's still saving lives." For 3 more years, the Corsair fought on, earning new respect from a generation of pilots who hadn't even been born when the first prototypes flew. A machine that outlived its war. By the mid-1950s, production finally ended. In total, more than 2,500 Corsairs had been built, a number that dwarfed nearly every other American fighter of its time. It had served with the U.S. Navy, the Marines, the British Fleet Air Arm, the French Navy, and even in smaller air forces around the world for decades to come. But more than the numbers, it was the myth of the Corsair that endured. Hollywood remembered it. Veterans remembered it. And future pilots studied it. Not as a relic, but as a lesson in what happens when design, courage, and necessity meet in perfect alignment. The Corsair had begun its life as an underdog, too heavy, too unstable, too wild for the deck of a carrier. Yet by sheer evolution and determination, it became one of the most successful fighters ever built. It was the machine that proved American industry could outthink, outbuild, and outfight even the most formidable opponent. And in that sense, it was more than a plane. It was a message that echoed from the skies of Bougainville to the mountains of Korea. That courage, guided by ingenuity, could turn even the most flawed creation into a masterpiece of survival. When the last Corsair squadron was retired in 1957, a few of the old pilots gathered to watch them fly one final time. The engines roared, and the bent wings caught the sun one last time. Blue, silver, and eternal. No speeches, no parades, just the sound of propellers fading into memory. But in that sound, they could still hear everything. The screams of the Pacific winds, the echo of the Zero's guns, the heartbeat of history itself. The war had ended, but the legend of the Corsair had only just begun. In every war, there are machines that define an era, not because of their beauty, but because of their necessity. The F-4U Corsair was one of them. It was not born perfect. It was not even born ready. It was forged in failure, refined through loss, and perfected in battle. The story of the Corsair is, in truth, the story of the men who refused to accept defeat, engineers who redesigned what others called impossible, and pilots who climbed into an aircraft that could kill them before the enemy ever had the chance. Together, they created something immortal. The Corsair was more than a fighter plane. It was a turning point, a moment when technology finally caught up with courage, when human ingenuity found a way to bend metal, physics, and fear into one living form. And in doing so, it changed not just the course of the Pacific War, but the very relationship between man and machine. For the pilots who flew it, the Corsair was both weapon and companion, unpredictable, ferocious, and alive. Many described it as having a soul, as if the roar of its engine carried every heartbeat of the men who built it, the men who flew it, and the men who never came home. Today, only a few Corsairs still fly. Their wings shimmer in air shows, their engines echo across quiet fields. But when they rise into the sky, for a brief moment, time bends. You can almost see the Pacific again, the clouds over Rabaul, the glint of the sun on metal, and the silhouettes of men who once ruled the heavens. History remembers the victors, but the sky remembers the brave. The Corsair was both.